Hello. Hi. We are meeting today for an interview for the Gaudeamus Book Fair, the famous book fair here in Romania. And we are talking to James Wyllie, a famous author as well, coming from London to talk about a very particular subject. His book, published by the publishing house, our publishing house, Litera, is called Nazi Wives, the Women at the Top of Hitler's Germany. I will introduce the author in just a few words and then start the debate itself. Our guest is an author. He's a screenwriter and also a documentary maker. He made documentaries for the BBC, and he is particularly interested in topics such as secret intelligence and the world wars. And he wrote this very interesting book and also other books about the acolytes of Hitler. So let's talk about the Nazi Wives. Such an intriguing title from the very beginning. Usually when we talk about the Nazi regime, we talk about the men and their atrocities and the crimes committed, but we forget, also forgetting the well-known cliche that behind every powerful man, there's a strong woman, sometimes even more powerful than her man, that these men had wives or mistresses or housekeepers, such as Hitler. And these wives contributed to their lives and sometimes to the politics they were indulging in, let's put it this way. Who were these wives or these women, and what was the part they played in the history of the Nazi Party, of the Nazi regime, and therefore the history of Europe and of mankind? Cherchez la femme is a typical French saying. Let's search for the woman behind the Nazi ideology, a prototype, if there is one.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, that's sort of the question that the whole book is trying to address, amongst other things. I mean, you know, like everything in life, it's always difficult to generalize. So each of the women I looked at had a different role, had a different relationship with their husbands, and had a different degree of participation in Nazi politics. And there are a number of women who were significant who I didn't look at in detail because essentially I made my choice to pick the women that I did on the basis that they all got involved with their husbands and Nazism before Hitler came to power. Now, it seems to be because, you know, once Hitler comes to power, I mean, a lot of people are attracted to the movement because they're in power. I mean, like anywhere, people follow whoever it is who's in power, don't they? So there were significant women, the wives of people like Albert Speer, Hitler's doctors, who you know did have influence, but they joined the movement after Hitler came to power, when they were the winning team, as it were, which is a different kind of situation. So I was interested in looking at the women who got involved when really Hitler was relatively insignificant and the Nazis were a very small party. And there was no real, you know, other than them believing in Hitler, you know, if you looked at Germany in 1927, 28 and said, is Hitler going to come to power in 6 or 7 years? Most people would have, you know, laughed. So that's ridiculous. So, you know, it seemed to me, you know, more interesting to look at those women who had been attracted to the movement at a time when, you know, the movement's prospects were fantastic. Because that showed an early commitment to Hitler, either personally or ideologically. And also in terms of their relationships with their husbands. You know, again, it's all very well marrying someone who's already rich and powerful. But if you're say Margaret Himmler sitting in a train carriage with some, slightly overweight young man with glasses who happens to be Heinrich Himmler, you fall in love with them then at that point. That's a very different kind of starting point, if you see what I mean. And
I do. I think it's very nice and somehow endearing of you to bring this testimony of their good faith. It's like you are pleading for their cause in terms of them not being attracted to the power or the wealth of these men. What was their purpose then? Why did they invest themselves in this regime? Out of love, out of conviction, out of their own belief, out of what? What was their main attraction?
Well, it's a mixture of those things, and it again depends on, like with any relationship in life, it depends where you are at that moment in time yourself, what stage of your life you're at. I mean, if you take, I start with Ilse Hess. I end with Ilse Hess because she was the first to get involved with the Nazis in 1920. So there isn't even a Nazi party really. Heard Hitler speak, and she's fallen for him and his ideology almost immediately. So she's a young, idealistic student at that point in her life, and she makes that commitment to him at that point. So that's an idealist, let's say, and she holds to that idealism her entire life. It's remarkable in itself. But then you've got someone like Gerda Bormann, who's only 12, 13 when she meets Hitler for the first time. So that's a different kind of relationship, obviously. Her father was a committed Nazi. And again, it's very early, it's 1920, it's 1921. So for her whole life really was about Nazism, from such a young age. Then you have someone like Carin Goering, Goering's first wife. Initially, her attraction is to Goering, the war hero, the WW1 flying ace, and she falls for him, the man. But once she's in Munich and she hears Hitler speak and meets Hitler, Hitler then becomes the sort of focus of her life. And for her mission is to make sure that Hermann is close to Hitler and significant in the movement. So she's a fanatic.
Yes, that was my next question. So all these women had something in common. They were well-educated, well-bred, coming from middle-class families. Right. They all believed in German traditions, in the supremacy of the German literature, of the German philosophy, of the German folklore. They were idealists, as you are saying, and also they were searching to maintain a status, wealth, power, high society. If they were not driven by power by itself, meaning money and other gains, they were certainly attracted by this ideal of the superior something, the superior race, the superior kind, the superior man, the superior ideals. Is this a pathology? I am going to make a parallel now with the wives of serial killers or the wives of psychopaths or sociopaths. For instance, Ted Bundy's wife, she had no idea about her husband's secret life. All these women usually claimed, and it was actually true, their innocence in believing that the man they were living with was a good person, a good father, a good citizen, a kind husband, a loving husband. It's almost unbelievable to think that they didn't have a hint, a clue about what was going on, especially since you tell the story very beautifully in your book, which reads like a detective novel almost, and it's very cinematic, of the furniture made of human skin or human bones that they had in their attics, or the atrocities that they witnessed somehow. How is it possible to fall into this, I don't know how to call it, bubble of oblivion?
Well, I think you can ask that question not just of those women, but of societies and humanity generally. I mean, I think our capacity to block out stuff, to just not see it, in order to maintain the sort of fiction of normality. Of yes, everything's fine. Yes, we had a nice dinner, and we're going to the theatre tomorrow night, and I mean, you just consider war itself. Bombs are dropping, on your cities, night after night. Yet people are still, talking about football or going to the pub or falling in love or trying to have a family, or, I think our ability to adapt is one thing, but also just, I don't think you don't have a Holocaust or a camp system on that scale or the barbarity that occurred, without hundreds and thousands of people blocking out that stuff. Yeah, and so we can talk about the guys at the top and how they were able to maintain the kind of fiction of domestic harmony while they're out signing, death warrants every day. But equally well for the guy who, the guy who works at the station, and every night the trains come through, the cattle trucks packed with the people, and he's still got to go home. He goes home to his wife and that day in, day out, and he knows what's happening. He can see what's going on, but he can live with that. And I think that I think it's a more, but by looking at their ability to shut out the bad stuff, I think that's not that unusual. I think we are able to do that, and it's sometimes just a coping mechanism, isn't it?
It is, yes, but in general, as a society or as a group of people. But when you live with a specific man and you know what he's doing, or you have a hint of what he's doing, it's like it's moving the accent from the general to the particular to the specific. It's this man I'm in love with, and this man is doing these things. How to cope with that? How do you transfer the responsibility of your own choice to a specific man? So you mentioned the fact that most of these women were attracted by Hitler himself. Was this a projection? For instance, Hitler didn't want to get married, so he had flings or affairs and a mistress, but he wasn't the invested type of man. He didn't want to have a family. Therefore, were they projecting onto their own husbands this idealistic infatuation with the Führer?
I think certainly in the case of Magda Goebbels, there's a lot of truth in that. Yes, I think with Hitler there's a degree of with Hitler liked women, yet this, at the same time having prehistoric attitudes about women and their role and all of that. He was actually I think he felt more comfortable around women as long as they worshipped him and said all the right things. But he was clearly more relaxed in their company than with men. And he always tried to have women around him. Like even, during the war, or when he's in his various bunkers, he's surrounded by his secretaries, and he'd wake them up at midnight so he could have someone, because he was an insomniac stage. So he would have someone to talk to all night. So his young secretaries would sit around dutifully while he talked and ate cake and that kind of thing, night after night. So he sought out female company. He's such a strange, obviously he's such a strange man, is an understatement, but, very, very early on, he made the decision, I am not getting married, I am not having children, as a political decision as much as anything else. With children, he said, if he were to have a son, no son would ever be able to live up to him. Therefore, a damaged, unhappy individual is a consequence. So he didn't want to have children on that basis. Again, he thought, being married would compromise his role as the kind of, leader figure. That would somehow undermine that mystique and that untouchability that he fostered over time. And that's he's a man making that decision. We talked about that to Rudolf Hess in prison after the Munich Putsch. So that's like 23. So he's still a young man when he's deciding that. So that, he stuck to that his whole life.
Now, coming back to the women.
Yes, sorry.
What was your attraction to this topic? Why did you want to investigate their lives or their attitude during the Nazi regime? Were they interesting in themselves, these women? How were they? If you were to dress the portrait of the Nazi wife, what would you say about her?
Well, I think you mentioned it slightly earlier. I think the fact that they were all middle-class women of varying degrees, some lower middle, some upper middle, some urban, some rural, but, still all educated, all from civilized backgrounds. And, to me, that's, an interesting aspect of the Nazi phenomenon, is that the most sort of radical / revolutionary elements of it were largely middle class. And the SS was, apart from the kind of people they hired to police the camps, that were often working class or peasants, the SS was run by the middle classes, by lawyers, doctors, and academics. And it seems to me interesting that the women, were of this class as well. So that interested me, the sort of bourgeois values, yet set, as you say, within a context of extremist racist politics, and then eventually, war and genocide and the rest of it, So that to me is interesting. And, I think it's very important that we look at these men as human. We've put them in the category of like mythological beasts, the evil. Whenever we would need a, prototype of the evil, there they are, as you say, along with the Ted Bundys of these worlds, there's the top Nazis. Yeah. But that kind of lets humanity off the hook, if you see what I mean. And they were human. They were just like you and me and the rest of us to that extent.
And that is the scariest part.
That's the scariest part, So by looking at the wives, you not only recognise that, but you explore that a bit more. That interests me. And just the fact that they'd been neglected, that they had been kind of slightly rubbed out of the picture. So that interested me. I'm always trying to find a new way, maybe, of looking at this familiar period. And then as I started investigating them, realising, that there were these commonalities in terms of, their commitment to Nazism and, that this predated, power and wealth and success and all these sorts of things. Again, ideology interests me, idealism interests me. Mm. That, the Nazis did not sit around saying, we are the evil people.
Of course not.
How can we do evil today? That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, we are the good guys. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in how idealism works. That, no matter how, to our sense, how insanely, awful their ideology was, for those engaged in it, it was right. It was good, and that's an interesting tension, it seems to me, and it also speaks to the fact that none of them apologised. Those who survived, had no regret, had few regrets, didn't apologise and didn't really admit that they were wrong. Again, that interests me, the way to which we can hold to our beliefs, regardless of the vast amount of evidence that those beliefs are not good,
So you're basically saying that ideology is the multitude of the ways we fool ourselves with.
Yeah, exactly. And, to a certain extent. And to me, that's interesting. That was interesting as well. They
couldn't have admitted anything because otherwise the cognitive coherence of their deeds would have fallen. So it's impossible for, I wouldn't call them mythical creatures or fantastic creatures as you call them, or fantastic beasts. I would call them downright monsters, because this is actually the main characteristic of a monster. He can't admit that he is the evil one. The question of the good and the evil is at the core of this debate. But when we talk about women, we have the tendency to generalize about their feelings of humanity. A woman is somebody who loves, who is kind by nature, because she has to nurture, she has to raise children. So to think that these women were raising their children, were loving their husbands, were doing their best to be the best wives or lovers or mothers is quite incongruous to the other side of their lives, to the side where they were mean, or they were against a certain part of the society, against other people. Yeah. So women against other women, mothers against other mothers. Why? For the sake of some man, these ones who wouldn't admit their guilt. Now, it's interesting that there's a wide variety of personalities in your book. Who is the most eccentric, or who was the one you would have been attracted to, not physically or like a man, but in terms of intelligence or beliefs or personality? Some were very fascinating as women. Some others were quite bland. Some others were housewives, and that was all. And they fulfilled this role perfectly. If you were to speak about just one Nazi wife, representative for her gender, let's say, who would that be?
I represent her gender. Well, to me, it would be between Ilse Hess and Magda Goebbels. Mm-hmm. Ilse Hess, because she was clearly very intelligent and a woman who actually wanted to be engaged in politics and in, the movement much more than she was allowed to, because of course they were, effectively told, "You're my wife now, forget about politics." And she interested me because she was into poetry and music and literature. So you could imagine having quite an interesting evening with Ilse Hess, just talking on that basis. She was, an interesting woman at that level. And in a sense, because what happened with her, and because she tried to cling to her idealism, as the Nazi movement, after it took power and it became clear the sort of direction Hitler was heading in, it was obvious that she had reservations. That there was, the possibility that her ideals were going to get tainted by what was actually going to happen. And because of what happened with her husband, with Rudolf Hess, when he flew to Scotland in 1941, that meant she was effectively exiled from the kind of inner circle. So she lost having any influence or any part in the Nazi elite from that time on. So in a way, she was sort of, when the worst of it was happening, she was sort of removed from it. And then I think, her story after the war, when she campaigns tirelessly for 40 years to get her husband out of jail, again, is kind of remarkable. And it's that weird thing that if she hadn't believed in Nazism, say she believed in something else, virtuous, you would look at her life and think, well, wow, that was a really remarkable woman, who actually did, despite all the things that happened to her, stuck to her beliefs, fought for her husband, showed loyalty and all those sorts of things. So she interests me because she's a challenge in a way to think about. And then Magda Goebbels, clearly highly intelligent, sophisticated woman. And again, I think would have liked to have played a much bigger role in the Nazi regime than she was allowed to. And frustrated and caught in this weird sort of love triangle between herself and Hitler and her husband, Joseph Goebbels. And her, she wanted to divorce him. She tried to divorce him. Hitler wouldn't let that happen. She suffered. She was meant to have lots of children because they were meant to have lots of children, being Nazi wives. But every child she had put her in hospital for months on end because she had a heart condition that was aggravated. So when she had her first child from her first marriage, the doctor said to her, you really shouldn't have any more children. But she dutifully went and the whole brood that she had with Goebbels to, great detriment to her health. So she's living with a man that she doesn't love, who's having sex with, anything that moves, frankly, much in front of her. She's in love with Hitler, who she can never be with. So that just, as a dramatist, or for me, that's just an interesting character. And the frustration with her is that, what we know about her, we know really from Goebbels' diaries. So we only get his view of her and their relationship. And she left virtually nothing written down for us to draw on. So she's something very enigmatic. And of course, the end of her story, which is, with the murder of her children and the suicide in the bunker and all of that is, again, what could lead a person to a point where they would do something like that, where they would have their own children poisoned. So that's just intriguing.
Well, she seems like a tragic heroine, but somehow I'm not inclined to say that, because that would give her the touch of humanity. Of course, all these people.
That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. All these people were humans. We're talking. It's a very, very thin line between making them look very evil and talking about them by emphasizing their flaws, but at the same time by keeping in mind that they were also human and they had, exactly what you said, a quite normal life. a life which was not meant to be lived during the war or during such disastrous times. They would love, eat, sleep, go to the movies, dress up, whatever, during normal times. And they would most probably have had extraordinary destinies as well, even if they wouldn't have lived in such dramatic times. Now, you were saying that we only know things about her from Goebbels' diary. How did you conduct your research? How do you gain access to this information from other books, or did you talk to people who had access to, I don't know, what kind of resources, letters or testimonies, or they knew? Yeah.
I mean, I looked at, obviously you end up looking at a whole load of different sorts of things. I mean, you've got the diary, the thing is you've got it's like anything, you have bits and pieces, so there are gaps. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason why I ended up writing about a group of women rather than trying to focus on one is because of the sort of gaps in evidence. So it would be hard to write a satisfying biography of any one single one of those wives that I wrote about, simply because you'd have big holes where you just don't know what was going on. Mm-hmm. But you do have, you have diaries, you have letters. And one of the things about the Nazi movement is that all the people involved with it at the higher levels tended, if they survived the war, tended to write about it. Mm-hmm. So you have an awful lot of relatively first-hand testimony. Obviously, a lot of it is tainted by people trying to put themselves in a better light, but there is a lot of, do you know what I mean? But there is still an awful lot of testimony. You've got all the Nuremberg trial evidence. You've got, and the very fact that, like Lina Heydrich, she wrote a book about Emmy Goering, wrote a book about her life. So you've got those things. You've got some of Margaret Himmler's diaries from certain periods. You've got some of Bormann and her husband's letters as well from certain periods. So you've got primary material to go with, the secondary resource material as well. So it's a bit, it's a bit of a patchwork of stuff, but there is a lot of material, one way or another. And then I found very useful was they ended up being books, but the accounts of the household staff, Hitler's household staff, his chauffeurs, his valets, his housekeepers. Because, unlike a lot of the elite who wrote about what happened, they didn't really have an axe to grind. No one was accusing them of anything particularly. So they're pretty honest, I think, in terms of, and it is a very close in view, they are very intimately, they're seeing everything day in, day out. So particularly for life at the Berghof and in Hitler's bunker towards the end, those kinds of things, their testimony was very useful. Little things like Hitler's sex life. There was all kinds of ridiculous theories about Hitler's sexual appetites and his perversities and his this, that, and the other. But in the end, you look at the housekeeper who changed his bed sheets. Bed sheets do not lie, about sexual activity. And she could just.
That's true, yeah.
In the end, and she said, okay, every now and then, but clearly not very often, just regulation sex, was happening.
Well, now
I believe that. To me, I said that's evidence.
If they were telling the truth, but as you say, there was no reason why would they lie? Just to preserve maybe the image of the Führer, or maybe, who knows?
If you look at different sorts of evidence, I was trying to find that kind of evidence where it was close in and personal, but not too compromised. Which again,
yes. Were these women tried or accused of any crimes? Did it happen for them to be publicly prosecuted or held responsible for any of their deeds or their husbands' deeds?
Yeah, I mean, they were all, I mean, those that survived, I mean, were all put through what was known as the denazification process.
Mm-hmm.
So they were held, you know, a year and a half by the end of the war while they were working out what to do with them, basically, I think. And then they became, you know, distinct from the Nuremberg prosecutions. There were denazification trials in German courts. But this is a much lower level of publicity and seriousness in terms of the sorts of penalties that could be imposed.
Mm-hmm.
They all went through that process, but they really all just got a slap on the wrist. And it really became about assets, like what of their financial and material assets, you know, were the result of their husband's criminal activities. Mm-hmm. You know, mm-hmm. So they paid at that level, and they paid some of them with a period of incarceration prior to these trials. But really, that was it. They were let off. But that was, you know, that was again part of their. They were just the women. They were just the wives. So in the attitudes of that time, it was like, well, of course they didn't matter. Of course they weren't important. Mm-hmm. And when they said we didn't know what was going on, they were believed on that basis that, mm-hmm. Oh, well, they're the wives. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are running out of time.
They were let off the hook. But again, it's very difficult to prove in a court of law, you know, their culpability in genocide. I mean, that's actually quite hard to prove.
Well, I thought maybe as moral agents, or just for the fact that they closed their eyes before the things their husbands were doing, just for that, and not to be accused publicly, but morally somehow they would have accused themselves, or they would have had the recognition of their wrongs, or maybe like their husbands didn't admit their crimes during the Nuremberg process, but for them maybe that would have been a rather interior process, a rather interior thought. Maybe they would have asked this of themselves: did I do wrong? But this is just
well, this what's frightening is that the only one who did was Emmy Goering, and that's Goering's second wife, the actress. Mm-hmm. And she was not really interested in Nazism or politics ever, you know. And in her book, she does reflect, and she just says we should have done more, and you know, clear going wrong, and, you know, were we right, etc., etc. So she asks all those questions. She's quite kind of, you know, she's not that tough on herself or her husband particularly, but at least she clearly, you know, reflected on things and did at the time when they were happening, you know. But the others, not at all. I mean, Lina Heydrich's book is actually very scary because it's so honest. It's like, yeah, we hated the Jews.
Okay, yeah. Sure.
So, you know, we thought was right for Germany, and my husband was a great man. So, you know.
Now we're running out of time, unfortunately. I have just one last question in a few words, because Eva Braun is the most well-known out of all these women. And you mentioned Hitler's staff. She was part of Hitler's staff in all the aspects of the term. So she was the housekeeper at Berghof. What was her position? How would you characterize her? Just briefly, because we don't have much time left.
Very, very difficult. She's a very enigmatic character because we know so little actually about her. She was clearly a smart person. You know, she wasn't a fool. She wasn't stupid. She was very, very young. people have to remember how young she was when Hitler kind of picked on her, because he liked women in their late teens, because he could control and manipulate them. So she's only 19 when she meets, or even maybe younger when she meets him. So, and certainly in her the younger period, in the 30s, she's clearly very infatuated. It's like a crush. You know, he treats her a bit like a fan. You know, he's very good to her for a bit and then he ignores her, etc. You know, but once she kind of becomes established, it's clear that Hitler has chosen her as his companion. She then, you know, she digs in at the Berghof. You know, and by the middle of the war, she is running the Berghof. You know, she had a group of intelligent women friends. She was interested in cinema, in film and fashion. She was actually quite different. She was actually quite like the sort of women that the Nazis were allegedly against. You know, like fashion, you know, Hollywood movies and all that sort of thing. And then of course, you know, then she makes the decision to die with him at the end. But by doing so, guaranteed some kind of immortality in some way or another. And in fact, in a way, you know, I think she wanted the world to know about her. You know,
do you think there was no
be a hidden, to be such a secret?
Do you think there was no other way out for her? And she thought that's just the grand finale. I wouldn't know what to do otherwise.
I mean, maybe. I mean, it must have been such. I mean, it's so hard to imagine what it must have been like to be there in those final, you know, those final days. What would her life have been like after the war? I mean, if the Soviets would have just, what would they would have disappeared her probably. So it's difficult to know. I mean, they were so convinced that the Soviets would just, you know, come in and murder them all or do something terrible to them anyway, that there is an element of that in this. But I don't know. It's so, when you get into that sort of level of irrationality, it's so hard. It's why did she do this? You think, well,
well, that's quite a story for anything related to the Nazi regime and to the world wars. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it, although the topic is horrific. But let's not forget and keep the hope that there is humanity even in the darkest times and even in the darkest people. Thank you so much, James Wyllie. And see you soon, I hope, next time for another interesting story and another interesting book. Thank you so much on behalf of the publishing house and on behalf of your audience here in Romania.
Thank you. It's been
goodbye. Thank you.
Yeah.